FIFA made $8.9 billion from the 2026 World Cup. The cities that hosted it, across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, are staring at a combined shortfall of more than $250 million. One side profited. The other side is still paying it off. That split isn't new, and it isn't unique to soccer. Every single Olympic Games on record has run over budget. Every one. The average overrun, 172%. There is no exception in the historical data. Not one host city, in nearly a century of games, has delivered the Olympics for what it promised. Not one, out of every host with reliable records, across 100 years of trying. Somebody always profits from hosting a mega event. It's just almost never the host. 4 mechanisms make that outcome close to guaranteed. One city, out of every host on record, found a way to break them. This video is the autopsy of both, starting with the mechanism itself, then 4 cities that proved it, 1 city that beat it, and the number that ties all 5 together. By the end, you'll know exactly why FIFA's number and the host city's number were always going to land on opposite sides of zero. 4 mechanisms explain the pattern. None of them require a corrupt official. None require an incompetent mayor. They work on honest governments exactly as well as careless ones, which is exactly why the same result keeps repeating decade after decade, regardless of who's in charge. The first is the winner's curse. Cities don't compete on the best plan. They compete on the rosiest promise. Whoever most underestimates the cost and most overestimates the benefit wins the bid, and then inherits the gap between that promise and reality. A gap nobody in the room is incentivized to shrink before the vote. It's the same logic that shows up in any competitive auction for something of uncertain value. The winning bidder is, almost by definition, the one who was most wrong about what the thing was actually worth. The second is an immovable deadline. The opening ceremony happens on a fixed date, broadcast worldwide. No matter what, so picture this. A contractor falls behind, 2 years out, on a games that legally cannot be postponed. What leverage does that contractor suddenly have? Almost total. The host has no alternative. It pays whatever it costs to finish on time, because the alternative is global humiliation on a date nobody can move. A city building an ordinary subway line can pause and renegotiate for a year if costs spike. A city 3 years from an Olympic opening ceremony, the entire planet already has circled on a calendar, has no equivalent option. Here's the part almost nobody plans for going in. The third mechanism is who actually keeps the money once the cameras leave. FIFA and the International Olympic Committee control the mobile revenue, broadcast rights, global sponsorships, licensing deals signed years in advance. That money leaves with them when the tournament ends. The host keeps something very different. The stadiums. Concrete doesn't travel. Debt doesn't either. A broadcast check clears the same way whether the games happen in Tokyo or Toronto. A stadium once poured stays exactly where it was built, and so does the bill for keeping its roof from leaking 20 years later. And the fourth mechanism is the benefit that was supposed to justify all of it in the first place. Tourism, a lasting legacy. It routinely fails to show up. Visitors who might have come for a normal vacations stay away, specifically because of the crowds and the inflated prices. Key meaning a city can host millions of Olympic visitors while barely moving its overall annual tourism numbers at all. And the legacy stadium, built for one specific event on one specific date, becomes what economists call a white elephant, too big for anything else, too specialized to repurpose, costing the city money every single year just to keep the roof from caving in, long after the broadcast trucks and the crowds are gone. 4 mechanisms. A bidding war that rewards the most optimistic liar. A deadline that erases the host's leverage entirely. An organizer that keeps the money that moves and leaves behind the money that doesn't. And a promised benefit that, more often than not, simply never arrives. Watch for all 4 in every case that follows. starting with the city that proved first and worst exactly how bad this arrangement can get. Every city after it had the exact same warning available. Almost none of them heeded it. One more thing worth naming before the case studies start. None of these four mechanisms are secret. Economists have written about them for decades. City councils that approve Olympic bids can, in theory, read the same research this video just summarized in 5 minutes. And they keep bidding anyway. That's the part that actually needs explaining. Not the mechanism itself, but why a documented, repeatable pattern keeps failing to change anyone's behavior before the fact, decade after decade, government after government. Part of the answer is that the costs and the benefits don't arrive on the same timeline or to the same people. The politicians who approve a bid get the ribbon cutting, the global attention, the 2 weeks of prestige, the bill for the stadium maintenance, the debt payments, the interest. That lands on whoever's in office 5, 10, 20 years later, and on ordinary residents who never got a vote on the bid in the first place. Short-term glory, long-term liability, hand it to somebody else. That mismatch alone goes a long way toward explaining why the same mistake keeps getting made. Election cycle after election cycle, city after city, decade after decade. Montreal remains the most extreme case on record, and it's where the modern pattern starts. Mayor Jean Drapeau told residents the games could no more run a deficit than a man can have a baby. The original budget, about $124 million. Confident words, wrong words. History would remember that quote for exactly the reason he hoped it wouldn't. The final cost, roughly $1.5 billion. An overrun of more than 1,000%, driven mostly by the Olympic Stadium, whose retractable roof faced delay after delay while the fixed 1976 opening date kept approaching regardless of whether the building was ready. That roof, by the way, never actually worked reliably even after the Olympics ended. It needed a full replacement decades later, adding hundreds of millions more on top of an already historic overrun. Locals took to calling the whole structure the Big Ow, not for the debt alone, but for the stadium's stubborn habit of continuing to cost money years, then decades, after anyone assumed the bill had finally been settled. Here's what that number actually meant for the people who lived there. Quebec created a dedicated tobacco tax to cover the gap. It stayed in place for 30 years. 30 years. Montreal didn't finish paying for a 2.5-week sporting event until 2006. 3 decades after the closing ceremony. An entire generation later, people who weren't even born in 1976 grew up paying 1 cigarette pack at a time for a stadium most of them had never used for anything Olympic at all. A tax sold to the public as temporary ended up outliving the athletes who competed and, in some cases, outliving the mayor who promised it would never come to this. So was Montreal just unlucky? No. Every mechanism from the last block is visible here in its purest form. The optimistic bid, the immovable deadline stripping away all leverage, a stadium that turned from showcase to permanent liability the moment the athletes went home. Locals still call the whole structure the Big O, not a nickname, a description that stuck because it was accurate for 3 straight decades. That should have been the warning every future host needed. It wasn't. Within 6 years, the almost identical sequence would repeat, this time triggered not by a construction crisis, but by a revolution on the other side of the world. It's worth pausing on why the warning didn't stick. Montreal's disaster wasn't hidden. It was front-page news for years, in multiple countries, precisely because the tobacco tax kept the story alive decade after decade. Every city that bid for the Olympics after 1976 knew, in broad strokes, exactly what had happened there. They bid anyway. That's not ignorance. That's the winner's curse from Block 2 doing exactly what it's designed to do, rewarding whichever city convinces itself, and everyone else in the room, that its own bid will somehow be the exception. And there's a specific reason the same mistake looks so easy to repeat. Every new host inherits a slightly different set of circumstances, a slightly different political moment, a slightly different set of local boosters insisting this time is different. Montreal's specific failure, a stadium roof that couldn't be finished on schedule, doesn't automatically warn a different city 28 years later, dealing with a completely different set of venues, a completely different climate, and a completely different geopolitical backdrop. The mechanism is the same. The specific trap it sets looks new every time, dressed up in whatever local details happen to be different this time around. Athens bid for the 2004 games at somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion. The final bill, roughly $11.6 billion. And that's the conservative number. Some tallies, once broader transportation is folded in, run as high as $19 billion. Either way, the multiple is staggering, 5 to 12 times the original promise, depending on which accounting you trust. A big piece of that gap has a name most people forget. Security. Athens was the first Summer Olympics held after September 11th. More than 70,000 police, soldiers, and security personnel were deployed. Another 35,000 troops guarded the borders and rail lines, while the entire Greek armed forces sat on alert for the length of the games. Security alone cost more than $1.5 billion, roughly the entire budget of the previous Sydney Games, spent on guards and checkpoints alone. Fear, in other words, had its own line item, and it was one of the largest in the entire budget. You've probably seen the photos, even if you didn't know where they came from. Empty swimming pools filled with stagnant green water, weeds pushing through Olympic seating, graffiti on walls where sold-out crowds once cheered. A softball stadium, a canoe course, entire training complexes, essentially abandoned within a few years of the closing ceremony. Photographers kept coming back for years, specifically because the images were so striking. A country's brief moment as the center of the sporting world, reduced within a few years to overgrown concrete nobody had found a use for, and nobody in government seemed in any particular hurry to fix. Here's the uncomfortable follow-up question. Did any of that money actually break Greece? Not on its own, but it didn't help. Jacques Rouge, the IOC president at the time, said publicly in 2011 that the Olympics played a part in the debt crisis that nearly took down the Greek economy 6 years later. One expensive decision, badly timed, layered on top of problems that already had almost no room left to absorb it. Notice what Montreal and Athens share, despite 28 years and an ocean between them. The optimistic number, the deadline with no leverage, the venues that outlive their usefulness by exactly 0 days. 2 different countries, 2 different languages, currencies, and political systems. Same mechanism. And the scale was about to get much, much larger. There's a specific reason the scale kept climbing rather than leveling off. Each new host wanted to outdo the last one. A bigger opening ceremony, a more ambitious skyline, a more impressive set of venues than whatever the previous city had managed. That competitive instinct, the same instinct that drives the winner's curse at the bidding stage, doesn't stop once a city actually wins. It keeps pushing costs upward all the way through construction, because nobody wants to be remembered as the host that built something smaller or plainer than the games before it. Athens is also where a specific irony shows up for the first time in this video, and it repeats in every case that follows, the very ambition that wins a city its bid. The promise of a spectacular, unforgettable games is the same ambition that guarantees the final bill will run away from the original number. A modest, disciplined bid rarely wins against a spectacular one, so the bidding process itself selects, structurally, for exactly the kind of overreach that turns into an overrun a few years later. The thing that makes a city look like the right host is the same thing that makes it the wrong bet. If you think this is a channel just about the perpetually engaged, this next block is exactly why we do what we do, and a fair place to say it plainly. We publish an autopsy like this every week because these patterns keep repeating in plain sight, and almost nobody adds up the total. Now back to the ledger and to 2 of the largest overruns this video has to offer. Sochi's 2014 Winter Olympics cost more than $50 billion, more than every previous Winter Games combined, and 4 times the original $12 billion budget. Russia built an entire winter sports region from scratch in a subtropical resort town that had never hosted anything at this scale. New rail lines, new roads, venues and terrain with no winter sports infrastructure at all, cut through mountains that had never needed to support anything heavier than a hiking trail. A single mountain cluster of ski and sliding venues required an entirely new road and rail corridor, built where none had ever existed, in one of the more dramatic pieces of forced infrastructure in Olympic history. What happens after the athletes leave? The bill doesn't stop. Sochi's venues cost roughly $1 billion a year just to maintain, more than Montreal's entire original 1976 budget, spent annually, indefinitely, on facilities that sit mostly empty for 50 weeks of the year. A ski jump built for a 2-week event needs snow grooming machines, security staff, and structural upkeep every single winter after, whether or not a single competition ever uses it again. Rio followed the same script 2 years later, over $20 billion total, against a $13 billion city commitment, forcing a $900 million federal bailout just to finish on time. The Maracanã, one of the most storied stadiums in world soccer, was stripped of seats and wiring within a year of the closing ceremony. Vandalized, effectively abandoned. Water venues built for Olympic sailing and rowing had well-documented quality problems even during the games themselves, undercutting the exact cleaner city legacy Rio had sold its own bid on. Sailors competed in water that local reporting had flagged as contaminated for years before the opening ceremony ever happened. And Brazil, like Greece before it, was already sliding into a serious recession by the time the games actually arrived, meaning the bill landed on a government with far less capacity to absorb it than it had when Rio won the bid 7 years earlier. Beijing's 2008 games, for comparison, ran to an estimated $45 billion. But roughly half of that went into transit systems the city needed anyway, a distinction worth holding on to, because this video comes back to it at the very end, with a budget of a completely different shape. Not every dollar attached to a mega event is actually spent on the event itself. Sometimes it's national infrastructure that would have been built regardless, simply accelerated and relabeled under an Olympic or World Cup banner for the headlines. Qatar's 2022 World Cup makes the same point at an even more extreme scale. Of the roughly $220 billion widely quoted in the press, only $6.5 to $10 billion actually went into the 7 tournament stadiums. The rest was national development that would have happened with or without a single soccer match. 4 cities, 4 decades, 4 completely different governments, cultures, and starting conditions. And in every single one, the same 4 mechanisms from Block 2 produced the same outcome. The pattern doesn't get weaker with scale. It gets more expensive to prove, which raises an obvious question. Has any city ever actually beaten it? Not stumbled into a smaller overrun by luck, actually beaten the mechanism outright. Before answering that, it's worth sitting with just how much money this section alone represents. Montreal, $1.5 billion. Athens, $11.6 billion. Sochi, $50 billion. Rio, $20 billion. Add them up and you're well past $80 billion across 4 host cities on 4 continents over roughly 40 years. Money that, in every single case, could have funded schools, hospitals, or transit systems with a genuine multi-decade payoff instead of a 2.5-week television broadcast that ends the moment the flame goes out. And notice the trend line inside those 4 numbers: $1.5 billion, $11.6 billion, $50 billion, $20 billion on a smaller original scale than Sochi, but still historic in its own right. The costs aren't just repeating, they're compounding decade over decade as each new host tries to top the spectacle of the last one. The exact dynamic this video just described a moment ago, playing out in the actual dollar figures rather than just in theory. $80 billion, 4 cities, 1 unbroken pattern. One has. Los Angeles, 1984, the only Olympics in the modern era, widely regarded as a genuine financial success. And the reason it worked confirms everything this video has argued, rather than contradicting it. If a channel is going to spend this much time proving a mechanism holds, it owes you the one case where it didn't, and an honest explanation of why. By 1984, Montreal's disaster had scared off almost every other bidder. Los Angeles was the only serious candidate, which meant it never had to win a bidding war built on rosy projections. It negotiated instead, from a position no other host has had before or since. No rival meant no pressure to promise more than the city could actually deliver. The city built almost nothing new. The games ran out of the Coliseum, standing since 1932, plus existing university and pro sports venues. Corporate sponsors, 7-Eleven, McDonald's, funded what little construction was actually needed. Television rights, sold in a bidding war between American networks, covered the rest. No new debt, no new white elephants. Peter Ueberroth, the businessman who ran the organizing committee, treated the whole operation like a company protecting its own balance sheet, rather than a government agency spending someone else's money, a mindset almost none of the other hosts in this video brought to their own games. The result, an operating surplus of roughly $215 million. Some tallies of total profit go as high as $232 million. Either way, it's the cleanest financial win in modern Olympic history. No bidding war means no winner's curse. Reused venues mean no construction crisis against an immovable deadline. Private sponsorship means the financial risk sat with corporations, not taxpayers. Every mechanism from Block 2, running in reverse. The surplus was large enough to endow a charitable sports foundation that's still funding youth programs across Southern California today. The closest thing to a genuine, lasting legacy any city in this video actually produced, built on private capital instead of public debt. Here's the twist that proves the market has actually noticed. In 2021, Brisbane won the 2032 Games completely uncontested. The first uncontested Olympic bid since Los Angeles in 1984. Oslo, Stockholm, Krakow, and Lviv all withdrew from the 2022 winter bidding. Boston, Hamburg, Rome, and Budapest all withdrew from the 2024 summer bidding. Hamburg's own citizens voted their bid down in a referendum. Boston's mayor walked away, saying the exposure to local taxpayers was simply too high. Rome's mayor pointed to the city's existing debt problems and pulled out before the process even got serious. When the cities doing the actual math start refusing to play, that's not coincidence. That's the market pricing in exactly the pattern this video just traced from Montreal to Rio. Cities that watched 50 years of the same mechanism and decided the prestige simply wasn't worth the exposure anymore. It's tempting to read Los Angeles 1984 as proof that hosting the Olympics can always be done this cheaply, if only cities were more disciplined. That's not quite right, and it's worth being honest about the limits of the exception rather than oversell it. Los Angeles succeeded partly because it had no competition, and partly because it already owned enough world-class infrastructure to avoid building almost anything new. Conditions that are genuinely hard to replicate for a city that doesn't happen to be one of the largest media and sports markets on the planet, with a stadium already sitting there since 1932. The lesson isn't, any city can do this. The lesson is narrower and more useful. Bidding wars and new construction are the two levers that break the budget, and any host serious about avoiding Montreal's fate has to find a way to avoid both, not just one. Most hosts, so far, have managed to avoid neither. Here's the number that turns 4 case studies into an established rule, tested against every Olympic host with reliable data. 4 cities, however carefully chosen, are still just 4 stories, which is exactly the kind of evidence a careful viewer should want tested against something bigger than a curated set of examples. So this video went and found that bigger test, built by researchers with no stake in whether the answer confirmed or contradicted anything argued so far. The Oxford Olympic study, led by Bent Fleivbjerg, Alexander Budzier, and Daniel Stewart, found that every single Olympic Games in their dataset ran over budget. Not most, all of them. 100%, with zero exceptions across decades of winter and summer games, in democracies and dictatorships alike. The average real overrun, 172%. The median, 118. In half of all games studied, the final cost came in at more than double the number the city won the bid with. Read that again. Half of every host on record didn't just overshoot. They doubled, and some went considerably further than that. Compare that against other infamous mega projects. Dams, nuclear plants, high-speed rail, airports. All of them run over budget too, routinely, and all of them have made headlines for exactly that reason. The Olympics beat every one of them anyway. Nothing else in large-scale construction fails this reliably or this expensively, a distinction that holds across an entire academic field built specifically around studying why big projects blow their budgets. Ask any economist who studies megaprojects for a living which category is worst, and the Olympics wins that unfortunate contest every time. So what does 100% actually mean here? It means there is no example, anywhere in the historical record, of a host city delivering the games at or under its promised number. Not one, in any country, under any government, at any point in nearly a century. Rich democracies with independent courts and free presses have failed to catch it in advance. Authoritarian states with total construction control have failed just as completely. That's not a management problem. That's a mechanism running exactly as designed every time it's been tried, regardless of who's in charge of trying it, regardless of how much political will exists to do better this time. Every single host believed, going in, that it would be the exception. None of them were. Economist Andrew Zimbalist puts it plainly in his book, Circus Maximus. The bidding process itself selects for the city willing to tell the least realistic story. Everything after that, the delays, the abandoned venues, the debt, is just that story finally coming due. Montreal wasn't mismanaged relative to Athens. Athens wasn't mismanaged relative to Sochi or Rio. Every one of them ran the exact same mechanism to the exact same conclusion, because the mechanism, not the competence of any individual host, is what actually determines the outcome. Zimbalist's larger point is that this isn't a solvable engineering problem. It's a structural feature of a process that rewards optimism over accuracy. And that reward doesn't change no matter which city, which decade, or which government you plug into it. Fix the process, and you fix the outcome. Nobody has fixed the process yet. That distinction matters enormously for how this video's central claim should actually be read. It would be more comfortable in a way if these 5 host stories had each been caused by a handful of obviously reckless officials making decisions everyone could see were bad at the time. That's not what the record shows. Each city was run by people who believed, going in, that their own circumstances were different enough to escape the pattern. The mechanism didn't care what any of them believed. It's worth being precise about what that rule does and doesn't claim, because overclaiming would undercut the very rigor this channel is built on. The rule doesn't say every host city loses the same amount, or that every overrun has an identical cause. Montreal's problem was a single stadium's roof. Athens's problem was security spending nobody had budgeted for after September 11th. Sochi's problem was building an entire region from nothing. Rio's problem was a national recession arriving at the worst possible moment. 4 different specific causes, one shared structural condition underneath all of them, a bidding process, and a deadline that together make it almost impossible for any of those specific problems to get caught or corrected before the bill comes due. Different symptoms, same disease, same prescription nobody's willing to take. Go back to where this video started. FIFA walked away from the 2026 World Cup with $8.9 billion. Host cities were left facing a $250 million shortfall. Same mechanism as Montreal. Just wearing a different jersey. FIFA keeps the mobile money. The cities keep the concrete. 50 years, 5 host stories, and the same split every single time. Because the split was never an accident. It was the design. there's a twist specific to 2026 worth naming, because it shows the arrangement getting worse, not better. Earlier World Cups split game day revenue with host cities, enough usually to come out roughly even. For 2026, FIFA took direct control of the tournament, and, with it, essentially all the revenue: media rights, sponsorship, ticketing, hospitality. Chicago looked at those terms and simply withdrew from the bidding. The cities that stayed signed on anyway and absorbed the exposure regardless. Canada's own government watchdog estimated total public support for hosting at over $1 billion Canadian dollars, committed before a single ticket had even been sold. Money spent on the promise of a payoff that, by this video's own historical record, essentially never comes, and didn't this time either. Then, in 2022, a different kind of exception showed up, and it's worth understanding exactly why, because it's not proof this mechanism broke. When Brent crude spiked toward $140 a barrel that March, nothing about hosting mega events changed. That's a separate story, about energy markets and who produces versus who imports oil, not a claim that every economic shock behaves identically to a stadium bill. Keep the two stories separate, because conflating them is exactly the kind of over-claiming a channel built on evidence should avoid. Mega events and oil shocks are both real mechanisms, tested separately, and neither one explains the other. Two different ledgers, two different sets of winners and losers, and this video only claims authority over one of them. Los Angeles hosts again in 2028, the same city that wrote the only profitable playbook in modern Olympic history, 44 years later, this time as the obvious favorite instead of the last bidder standing. Will it repeat 1984's discipline? Existing venues, private capital, no bidding war to overpromise its way into? Or will it take the leverage of being the obvious choice and make the same optimistic bet that's sunk every other host since Montreal? Early reporting on the budget already shows some of the same upward pressure that preceded every other games in this video, even with organizers publicly committed, on paper, to reusing existing venues wherever possible. History in this video has not been kind to promises made on paper. 100% of Olympic Games have run over budget. Exactly one made money by refusing to play the same game every other host agreed to. That's not a story about bad luck. It's a story about a system that works one way for one side, and about the rare exception that proves the other side isn't actually powerless. It just has to be willing to say no. Whether Los Angeles remembers that lesson in 2028, or whether the wave of withdrawn bids that gave Brisbane an uncontested games turns out to be a permanent shift rather than a temporary pause, is a story worth watching closely, and one this channel intends to keep watching. One last number before this video ends, to make sure the scale actually lands. FIFA's $8.9 billion in 2026. The IOC and its host cities have moved similar or larger sums for decades. Across nearly 50 years of games, this video has now walked through in detail. Montreal, Athens, Sochi, Rio, and the tournament that opened this video. Different sports, different decades, different continents, the same four mechanisms working exactly as designed every single time. Nobody in any of these host cities set out to lose money. The system was simply never built to let them win. It was built to let somebody win, just never the city holding the stadium. If you want the next documented breakdown of where the money and the power actually go, subscribe. We publish a new investigation like this every week, built the same way this one was. Public filings, dated numbers, and the mechanism underneath the headline.